Devon Achane will be the best running back in college football in 2022 on this episode of the Locked On Aggies podcast.
You are Locked On Aggies, your daily podcast on the Texas A&M Aggies. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome back to the Locked On Aggies podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. I am your host, Joey Eitz. Thanks for making Locked On Aggies your first listen every day. We are free and available wherever you get your podcast. Today's episode is brought to you by Bet Online. Bet Online has you covered this season with more props, odds, and lines than ever before. Bet Online, where the game starts. Like I said, Devon Achane will be the best running back in college football in 2022. You might call that a hot take. I don't really care. The impact that this man is going to have on the Texas A&M offense this year, being the primary runner, is going to be palpable very, very early. Most people would likely consider Bijan Robinson, who happens to be a junior running back from the University of Texas, to be the presumed running back one in the nation for this coming season. We're going to go through and compare a few statistics here between Achane and Robinson and just give some perspective on exactly what it is that this man, Devon Achane, can bring to an A&M offense that has needed big explosive plays for a long time, that has needed the capacity to break off huge runs, and he's already shown in his career the capability to do that. We've seen him do it on special teams. We've seen him do it on offense. We've seen him break games wide open, break teams' backs with big runs, and he's going to have even more opportunity in 2022 to do that moving forward. So for a little bit of context, we're going to use 2021 statistics here. We're going to compare Devon Achane to Bijan Robinson. Okay, so Achane had 130 attempts in 2021 to Robinson's 195. So Robinson essentially had 150% of the carries that Achane had in 2021. The average yards per attempt for those guys on those carries that they had, Achane averaged 6.8 yards per carry. Robinson averaged 5.8. Let's be clear, this is not an indictment on Robinson at all. That's an unbelievable number to maintain over almost 200 carries. Devon Achane averaged a yard per attempt higher than that. If he's able to sustain most of these numbers that we're going to talk about with a heavier workload like he will see in 2022, there's almost no doubt he's going to be the best running back in college football. Touchdown rate, in other words, on what percent of their carries do these guys score a touchdown? Devon Achane, 6.9%, almost 7% of his carries, he scores a touchdown. I believe he had 9 touchdowns in 2022 as a runner, not as a receiver. Bijan Robinson had 11 touchdowns, but his touchdown rate was only 5.6%. He had so many more carries, but fewer touchdowns in those carries. He put the ball in the dirt, in pay dirt, at a lower rate than Devon Achane did in 2021. First down rate, same sort of concept. How many of your carries, what percentage of your carries resulted in a first down? All of these numbers, just for reference, come from Pro Football Focus. So we're comparing apples to apples here. First down rate for Devon Achane, 38%. Nearly 40% of this man's carries turn into first downs. Bijan Robinson, first down rate, 27%. Again, 10 percentage points higher for Achane than Robinson, just with a smaller sample size. Yards after contact per attempt. That's pretty self-explanatory. Devon Achane, 4.02. Bijan Robinson, 3.94. Again, Achane, greater than. Carries of 10 plus yards. They each had 27 carries of greater than 10 yards. But it took Robinson 150% of the carries that it took Achane to reach that number. Carries of 15 yards or more. Achane 18, Robinson 15. Again, 2/3 of the carries for Achane. Robinson had 150% of the carries that Achane had, and Achane had more carries of greater than 15 yards than Robinson did. He's just a huge, big play waiting to happen. In the receiving game, their numbers are actually very similar. Achane had 24 catches for 261 yards. Robinson had 26 catches for 293 yards. But Achane also ran a significantly lower number of routes than Robinson did. In his yards per route run, in other words, he gained those 261 yards. He ran X number of routes. That creates a yards per route run average for Achane of 1.85 yards per route run. For Robinson, 1.36 yards per route run. Each route that Devon Achane gets out in is worth almost a half, or basically exactly a half a yard more than any route that Bijan Robinson gets out in. Oh, and he only had 2 drops as opposed to Robinson's 3 drops. The numbers bear it out. At the smaller sample size, Devon Achane was a much more efficient and effective runner of the football. And now the next argument might be, hey, that's a smaller sample size. You get into a bigger sample size, he's more likely to get hurt. But Bijan Robinson got hurt in 2021 and missed the last couple of games of the year with a dislocated elbow. Now, that's a freak accident. That could happen to anybody, but it just proves that Bijan is not immune to those same concerns that Devon is subject to. In fact, Robinson only played 9 games as a freshman as well. Got hurt in one of those games after a couple of carries. Another freak accident, but that kind of stuff happens when you're running the ball. So Robinson is yet to show in 2 years at the college level that he can play a full season. Devon hasn't either, but for some reason people are assuming that, or people are making the assumption that based on Robinson being a larger back, he's going to be a better back at the larger sample size than Devon Achane is, and I don't buy it. We're going to talk a little bit about practice updates. Fall camp is going on. We're going to get to all that. But first, I want to tell you guys about BetOnline. BetOnline.net is the fastest and easiest way to check in on all your betting needs. Find all your favorite sports and events at the #1 source for odds, lines, and games. Find reviews and news of every league, including Major League Baseball, the NFL, NBA, NHL, combat sports, esports, and yes, even golf. BetOnline continues to be the top online resource for all your sports wagering information, from live in-game betting, scores, and podcasts. They have you covered. Head to BetOnline today and use your mobile device to learn more about the action happening. BetOnline, where the game starts. We're going to get into a practice update. We're going to start on the offensive side of the ball. A&M has had a couple of practices since our last show. Let's get to it. It all starts with the quarterback. We've had this conversation before. The quarterbacks continue to rotate. Jimbo Fisher said in his press conference earlier this week that those quarterbacks have taken, in his words, the exact same number of reps with the ones between Max Johnson and Haynes King. So our theory from earlier in the week that maybe the rotation was starting to tilt towards Haynes, maybe not so much, not yet. They all continue to rotate. They all seem to be progressing well in the drill work that we get to see from some of the video clips and some of the insiders get to see that are actually on site in College Station. In terms of the young guy, Connor Wegman seems to be coming on. It's going to take a lot for him to overcome and overtake the head start that those veterans have, that Haynes King and Max Johnson have. It doesn't mean that it can't happen. It doesn't mean that it won't happen at some point this year, maybe, especially if there's some injury and some shuffling and things like that happens. But it's going to take a lot for him to get ahead of Haynes and Max. And that's not necessarily a commentary on Connor as much as it is a reflection of the work that Haynes and Max are doing at quarterback right now. The first scrimmage, we've been talking about how these scrimmages are going to be important. The first scrimmage for the team is this Saturday. We're going to start to see rotations start to clarify as we go from the first scrimmage into the second scrimmage in a couple of weeks. And then as we get to once we get past that second scrimmage, we will likely have a very good idea the last 10 to 12 days or so before the season gets rolling. We'll get a much better idea at quarterback and some of these other spots where there's some rotation taking place. We may start to see some reps get weighted a little bit differently, and we'll keep an eye on that, of course, so that we can get you guys the best information possible. From an injury standpoint, Bryce Foster, who we talked about earlier this week, and Anaya Smith, who have been out for a few days, are back working through protocols. NCAA has certain protocols that force players to practice in a jersey and shorts before they can practice in shoulder pads and shorts, before they can practice in full pads and take part in full work. So Bryce Foster and Anaya Smith are taking part in those protocols as we go through practice. Chris Marshall is back to full work. He missed a couple of days, but he had already gone through those protocols of acclimation. So he is now back to full work, came back and has had a couple of good days of practice. Layden Robinson, Big L, the right guard, is still sitting out. We'll repeat this on the defensive side of the ball. Also, Jimbo Fisher said again in his press conference this week that there are no serious long-term or season-threatening injuries on the team as it sits right now. So that should give us some comfort with Layden Robinson in terms of when we might see him back. He is a veteran player, so even if he misses some time early in camp, it shouldn't take long for him to ramp up and be ready to play week one and get him sort of rolling throughout the non-conference slate, and he'll almost certainly be ready for the conference slate. When we go out wide to the wide receivers, there's one name that we've said over and over throughout camp since the spring, over the summer, and now in fall camp, and that is Evan Stewart. That man is the truth. He is going to be a huge impact player immediately for A&M. He's a game-changing weapon on the outside. We've talked about his speed. We've talked about his quickness, his route running. Jimbo Fisher and some of the other guys have talked about his understanding of the game and how that puts him in position to succeed early. We're going to see them take advantage of that almost immediately for A&M in this offense. And we're going to see what that looks like when you combine Evan Stewart with Devon Achane, like we talked about earlier in the show, and then you roll Anaya Smith into that, and you roll some of these other wide receivers, and then some of the tight ends in, and you're going to have a really dynamic offense. And with the way the quarterbacks seem to be trending, the offense seems to be in really good shape, which is the major question for A&M with the elite talent that they have on defense that we'll talk about in the next segment as well. Talking about tight end, the Swede, Theo Orstrom, he's got a chance to be special at tight end. He's just a huge man who happens to be extremely smooth and extremely athletic. And at the tight end position specifically, that's an extremely lethal combination. He's got to develop. He's got to learn. He's very young, and he's coming from Europe. He didn't play the same level of whatever here we'd call it high school football. They may call it prep football or something like that. But he didn't play with the same consistent level of competition that some of these really high-rated guys. He didn't play the same guys that Evan Stewart played in high school, for example. So he's going to have – he didn't get the coaching that some of these guys have. He's going to take some development, but he's going to be there. And at some point this year, he's going to make some impact. At some point next year, he's really going to be ready to make a huge impact. What a huge get for Jimbo in the class of 2022. As we move to the defensive side of the ball, on the defensive line, Anthony Lucas and Levius Overton, as true freshmen at defensive end, are standing out in big ways. They're spending a lot of their time with the second team, but on a defensive line, those second team guys are going to play a lot. And these two guys, as true freshmen, are standing out, continuing to make plays. They are going to be impact players for A&M at some point in 2022. Speaking of the defensive line, the depth on that defensive front is just absolutely insane. They're probably 10 deep at defensive end and defensive tackle combined, with guys who just belong in the SEC, that have SEC bodies, SEC athleticism, and are capable of competing with what the SEC can bring to the table on the offensive front. The story is very similar to defensive back. Over the course of the last week, Miles Jones missed some time at one practice. Tyreek Chappelle sat out of practice. But it didn't matter. Backup guys like Jalen Jones and Brian George stepped right in, and the defense didn't really miss a beat. We all know what Antonio Johnson and Damani Richardson bring. We know about the young talent that A&M brought in over the last couple of years in their defensive back recruiting classes. That group and the group up front, just extremely, extremely deep with very high level talent. When we talk about the guys in the middle, Adrian Cooper's flying all over the field. Everybody who watches practice compliments Edge on his ability to close on ball carriers and on pass catchers when they're in the middle of the field. And that's just, it's so important at the linebacker spot to be able to identify and close. And he has that just elite reaction and closing ability that will make things very difficult in the middle of the field, where teams are going to have a tough time running on A&M because of the defensive line that they have. They're just going to have a tough time blocking the front. And they're going to have a tough time throwing deep on A&M because of the talent A&M brings at the secondary level. So teams are going to try to attack A&M in the middle of the field and at the second level. They're going to try to manipulate those second-level defenders, use run-pass options, things like that, to get the ball past the defensive line in front of the secondary and create significant gains that way. Adrian Cooper's ability to react and close quickly on a receiver or a ball carrier who gets at that second level or before they get to that second level is going to be massive for this A&M defense. And Martrell Harris, true freshman, I mean, we're going to keep repeating this phrase. These true freshmen keep playing incredibly well. They keep making big-time plays. That's happened for Martrell Harris over the last few days as well. Injury news on the defensive front, Walter Nolan and Andre White are still being held out of practice. We will see, again, Jimbo Fisher says there are no long-term or season-threatening injuries at this point in time. Maybe they are sort of leaning on their depth and allowing Walter to come along slowly at defensive line, and Andre White sort of the same situation with the linebackers with the way Adrian Cooper and Martrell Harris are playing, like we spoke about. Smoke Bowie was back in full work towards the end of the week, so that's great news, again, for the young players in the secondary. Guys, that's going to do it for our show. Thanks so much for joining me today. We're going to keep trying to get you the best information that we possibly can about what's going on at camp. We got a practice on Friday, a scrimmage on Saturday. We'll see what news and notes come out of those, and then we'll also see how those practices and that scrimmage affect the rotations of guys moving forward and getting closer to the season. You can find me on Twitter at Joey Ikes. You can read my writing about all things Texas A&M over at aggieswire.usatoday.com. You can follow the show on Twitter at Locked On Aggies, and please subscribe to the show on your podcast platform of choice. leave us a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts, and check out our YouTube channel, Locked On Aggies, as well. Be sure to like, comment, share, subscribe, the notification bell so you get notified every time we post a new show. Again, please leave a rating and 5-star review. Thank you so much, guys. Now that you've made Locked On Aggies your first listen of the day, get more on the SEC by making Locked On SEC your second listen. Every day, Chris Gordy is your host, and he will take the local experts of Locked On, and you will make a journey across the SEC in 30 minutes or less. Make Locked On SEC your second listen. That's Locked On SEC.